In the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan, where death whispered through every valley and survival meant outsmarting an enemy that seemed to read minds, the most elite warriors in the world faced their greatest challenge. Navy SEALs who had conquered impossible missions across the globe found themselves hunted by ghost-like snipers who never missed their mark. These weren't ordinary fighters. They were phantom marksmen who could disappear into thin air after claiming their victims, leaving behind only fear and frustration. For months, these enemy snipers had earned a terrifying reputation. Military commanders called them unbeatable. Hardened soldiers spoke their names in hushed tones. Even the bravest warriors felt their blood run cold when entering territories where these deadly phantoms operated. They had turned the art of precision killing into something almost supernatural, picking off targets from impossible distances and vanishing without a trace. But in the shadows of this seemingly hopeless war, one person was about to change everything. She didn't look like a typical warrior, and many underestimated her quiet demeanor and methodical approach. Yet she possessed something that would prove more deadly than any weapon, an unshakable determination and skills that would turn the hunters into the hunted. This is the true story of how one remarkable individual dismantled what many believed was an unstoppable force, picking apart the enemy's deadly network one precise shot at a time. It's a tale of patience, intelligence, and lethal precision that would redefine what it means to be unbeatable in the world's most dangerous battlefields. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain of the Kunar province when Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell first heard about the ghosts. She sat in the briefing tent, her weathered hands wrapped around a cup of black coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. Around her, fellow Navy SEALs shifted uncomfortably in their seats as Colonel Richards spread photographs across the table like a deadly deck of cards. Each photograph told the same horrifying story. American soldiers caught in the crosshairs of invisible enemies. Precision shots that defied explanation. Bodies found with wounds so clean and deadly that even experienced medics shook their heads in disbelief. The enemy snipers operating in this region had achieved something that military tacticians thought impossible. They had become completely unpredictable yet devastatingly effective. Gentlemen and lady, Colonel Richards nodded towards Sarah, his voice carrying the weight of too many sleepless nights. What you're looking at represents 18 months of pure hell. These enemy marksmen have eliminated 47 of our personnel and wounded countless others. They operate in small cells, never more than 3 at a time, and they know these mountains better than we know our own backyards. Sarah studied each photograph with the analytical eye that had made her one of the most respected snipers in the Navy. The entry wounds, the angles, the distances, everything spoke of marksmen who possessed not just exceptional skill, but an intimate understanding of advanced ballistics and tactical positioning. These weren't amateur fighters getting lucky shots. These were professionals who had turned killing into an art form. Staff Sergeant Martinez, a veteran of 3 tours, leaned forward with skepticism written across his scarred face. Sir, with respect, we've dealt with skilled enemy snipers before. What makes these guys so different? We've got the best equipment, the best training, and superior numbers. The colonel's expression darkened as he pulled out a tablet displaying a detailed map marked with red dots. Each dot represented a confirmed kill by the enemy sniper network. The pattern that emerged made Sarah's blood run cold. The kills weren't random or opportunistic. They formed a deliberate strategy that had effectively cut off 3 major supply routes and isolated forward operating bases across the region. What makes them different, Martinez, is that they've never missed a shot they've taken. Not once in 18 months. They choose their targets with surgical precision, strike without warning, and disappear into terrain that our drones and satellites can't penetrate. We've lost more experienced personnel to this network than to any other enemy force in the entire theater. The briefing continued with intelligence reports that painted an increasingly grim picture. The enemy snipers seemed to anticipate American movements before they happened. They struck during shift changes, caught patrols at their most vulnerable moments, and eliminated key personnel with shots that sometimes traveled over a mile through challenging mountain terrain. Most unsettling of all, they seemed to understand American tactics better than many American soldiers did. Captain Thompson, the unit's commanding officer, stood up and began pacing behind the chairs. His normally steady voice carried an edge of frustration that everyone in the tent could feel. Intelligence suggests these aren't local fighters. We're dealing with marksmen who received advanced training, possibly from former Soviet military instructors or other foreign specialists. They use modified rifles that fire ammunition we can't always identify, and they've adapted sniper techniques that combine traditional mountain warfare with modern technology. Sarah raised her hand, speaking for the first time since the briefing began. Sir, what's our mission parameters? Are we hunting specific individuals or dismantling the entire network? Both, Colonel Richards replied without hesitation. Command wants this threat neutralized completely. These snipers have created a climate of fear that's affecting morale across multiple units. Soldiers are refusing to take point positions. Patrol leaders are avoiding necessary routes. The psychological impact is almost as damaging as the actual casualties. The intelligence officer, a thin man with nervous eyes, spread out satellite images that showed the mountainous region where the enemy operated. The terrain was a sniper's dream. Countless hiding spots, natural camouflage, and elevation advantages that could turn any hillside into a deadly shooting gallery. Rock formations created natural blinds, while ancient goat paths provided escape routes that would be nearly impossible for pursuing forces to follow. The enemy has divided this region into overlapping zones of control, the intelligence officer explained, using a laser pointer to highlight specific areas on the map. When we move forces to counter one cell, another cell repositions to maintain coverage. It's like playing chess against an opponent who can see our moves before we make them. Sarah studied the terrain features with growing interest. Her mind began processing elevation changes, wind patterns, and potential shooting positions the same way a musician might read a complex piece of sheet music. Years of training had taught her to think like a sniper, but, more importantly, to think like the prey of a sniper. She understood both sides of the deadly equation. The briefing concluded with assignment of specific roles within the counter-sniper operation. Most team members would focus on patrol modification, route security, and intelligence gathering. But Sarah received different orders. She would be hunting the hunters, using her own exceptional marksmanship skills to turn the tables on enemies who thought themselves untouchable. As the other personnel filed out of the briefing tent, Colonel Richards approached Sarah with a folder marked with the highest security classifications. Inside were detailed profiles of 3 suspected enemy snipers, compiled from witness statements, ballistic analysis, and pattern recognition software that the military rarely deployed outside of the most critical operations. Mitchell, I'm going to be straight with you, the colonel said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. These profiles represent our best guesses about who we're facing, but the truth is we know almost nothing for certain. What we do know is that conventional tactics have failed completely. We need someone who can think differently, someone who can become as unpredictable as they are. The first profile belonged to a marksman they had designated Alpine. Intelligence suggested he was responsible for 11 confirmed kills, all at extreme range and high-altitude conditions. His signature was shots that seemed to defy the laws of physics, bending around cover and striking targets who believed themselves completely protected. Alpine never fired more than once from any position, and he seemed to prefer targeting officers and communication specialists. The second profile covered a sniper called Phantom, who specialized in close-range urban warfare adapted for mountain environments. Phantom's kills were characterized by perfect timing and positioning that suggested an almost supernatural understanding of human behavior. He could predict when soldiers would move, where they would seek cover, and how they would react under stress. Phantom's victims were usually found with evidence that he had been watching them for extended periods before taking his shots. The third, and most troubling profile belonged to someone the intelligence community had named Shadow. Shadow appeared to be the network's leader and most skilled operator. His kills demonstrated not just exceptional marksmanship, but tactical genius that suggested formal military training at the highest levels. Shadow's shots often served strategic purposes beyond simple elimination. He would wound key personnel in ways that required multiple soldiers to provide aid, effectively removing entire squads from combat effectiveness with a single bullet. Sarah absorbed every detail in the profiles, but she also recognized their limitations. The information was largely theoretical, based on analysis of after-action reports and crime scene investigations. To truly understand these enemies, she would need to get inside their heads, to think like they thought, and see the battlefield through their eyes. That night, Sarah lay on her narrow cot, staring at the tent ceiling while the sounds of the base settled into the familiar rhythm of a military installation trying to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come easily. Her mind was already working through scenarios, calculating angles and distances, and trying to piece together the tactical puzzle that had stumped some of the military's best strategic minds. She thought about her own training, the countless hours spent learning to become invisible on a battlefield, to control breathing and heartbeat, to make shots that others considered impossible. But she also thought about the psychological aspects of long-range warfare that weren't taught in any manual. The patience required to wait hours or even days for the perfect shot. The mental discipline needed to remain motionless while uncomfortable and alert to every detail of a complex environment. Most importantly, Sarah began to understand that defeating these enemy snipers would require more than superior marksmanship. It would require her to become something she had never been before, not just a hunter, but a hunter of hunters who had perfected the art of making themselves impossible to find. The war she was about to fight would be as much psychological as tactical, and the stakes couldn't be higher. The enemy had spent 18 months building a reputation for being unbeatable. Tomorrow, Sarah would begin the careful, methodical process of proving them wrong. Sarah's first real encounter with the enemy network came 3 weeks after the briefing. On a morning when the mountain mist hung so thick that visibility dropped to less than 50 meters. She had been studying patrol routes and attack patterns, spending countless hours analyzing every piece of intelligence the military had gathered about the ghost snipers. But all that preparation couldn't fully prepare her for the moment when theory became deadly reality. She was positioned on overwatch duty for a supply convoy moving through the notorious Charta Valley, a winding passage that had become synonymous with sudden death and vanishing enemies. Her perch was a carefully chosen rocky outcrop that provided excellent visibility of the convoy route, while offering multiple escape options if her position became compromised. Through her scope, Sarah watched the line of armored vehicles navigate the treacherous mountain road with the cautious precision of soldiers who knew they were entering a killing zone. The attack came with the surgical precision that had made the enemy snipers legendary among American forces. At exactly 10:37 in the morning, when the convoy was passing through the valley's most vulnerable choke point, a single shot rang out from somewhere in the maze of rocky formations on the southern slope. The bullet struck the lead vehicle's communications specialist through a gap in his body armor that couldn't have been more than 6 inches wide. The shot was impossible by conventional standards, fired through swirling mist at a target moving at 15 miles per hour from a distance that Sarah's rangefinder calculated at nearly 1,400 meters. But what happened next taught Sarah more about her enemies than months of intelligence reports could have provided. Instead of chaos and panic, the convoy responded with practiced efficiency that spoke of extensive experience with sniper attacks. Vehicles immediately moved to predetermined positions that minimized exposure while maximizing mutual support. Soldiers dismounted and took cover with movements that had clearly been rehearsed countless times. The entire unit transformed from a vulnerable column into a defensive formation in less than 30 seconds. The enemy sniper seemed to have anticipated this exact response. As soldiers moved to their defensive positions, a second shot came from an entirely different direction. the eastern ridge that Sarah had visually cleared just minutes earlier. This bullet wounded the convoy's medic with surgical precision, striking him in the shoulder in a way that incapacitated him without killing him. The shot served a dual purpose. It removed the unit's medical support while creating a casualty that would require additional personnel to evacuate safely. Sarah realized she was witnessing tactical brilliance that went far beyond simple marksmanship. The enemy wasn't just shooting American soldiers. He was manipulating their responses, using their own training and procedures against them. Each shot was calculated not just for accuracy, but for psychological and strategic impact that would compound over time. Through her scope, Sarah began the painstaking process of trying to identify the enemy's position. The mist and complex terrain made visual acquisition nearly impossible, but years of training had taught her to look for subtle signs that most observers would miss. Disturbed vegetation, unusual shadows, anything that might indicate human presence in an environment that should contain only rocks and wind. The third shot came 20 minutes later, and this time Sarah was ready. Her eyes were locked on the eastern ridge when she caught the muzzle flash, barely visible through the mist, lasting for less than 1/10 of a second, but enough to give her a bearing. The enemy was positioned in what appeared to be a natural cave or rock formation approximately 800 meters from her own location. More importantly, his position suggested he had been observing the convoy route for an extended period, possibly days, studying American response patterns and identifying optimal shooting angles. Sarah faced a critical decision. She could attempt to engage the enemy sniper immediately, or she could continue observing to gather more intelligence about his methods and capabilities. The tactical situation favored observation. The convoy was already conducting evacuation procedures, and a hasty shot at an incompletely identified target might reveal her own position without guaranteeing elimination of the threat. Instead, Sarah did something that went against every instinct developed through years of combat training. She remained perfectly still and watched as the enemy sniper began his own extraction procedure. Through her scope, she caught glimpses of movement that revealed crucial information about his equipment, his escape routes, and, most importantly, his methods for remaining undetected. The enemy moved with the fluid efficiency of someone who had performed this exact sequence dozens of times. He withdrew from his firing position using a path that kept him concealed from multiple observation angles simultaneously. His route took advantage of natural dead space that would be invisible to counter-sniper teams positioned at conventional Overwatch locations. Most tellingly, his movement pattern suggested he possessed detailed knowledge of American surveillance capabilities and tactical doctrine. As the enemy disappeared into the mountainous terrain, Sarah began the methodical process of analyzing everything she had observed. The shooting positions, the timing of the attacks, the selection of targets, and the extraction procedures all painted a picture of an opponent who combined exceptional individual skills with systematic preparation that bordered on the scientific. Her radio crackled with reports from the convoy. 3 casualties, all non-fatal, but serious enough to require immediate evacuation. The psychological impact on the remaining personnel was obvious even through the professional military communications. Soldiers who had completed multiple combat tours were describing the experience in terms usually reserved for supernatural encounters. The enemy had achieved something that conventional warfare rarely accomplished. He had created genuine fear among elite military personnel. Sarah spent the remainder of the day conducting a detailed reconnaissance of the area where the attack had occurred. Using techniques that combined traditional tracking with modern forensic analysis, she began building a comprehensive picture of how the enemy sniper had prepared for and executed his ambush. The primary shooting position revealed sophisticated camouflage techniques that utilized both natural materials and man-made items to create concealment that was nearly perfect. The enemy had used local vegetation, carefully placed rocks, and what appeared to be specialized fabric to create a hide that would be virtually invisible even to observers who knew exactly where to look. Brass casings had been carefully collected, leaving no ballistic evidence that could provide information about ammunition types or weapon characteristics. More disturbing was evidence that the position had been prepared well in advance of the attack, where patterns in the vegetation and soil compaction indicated the location had been visited multiple times over several weeks. The enemy hadn't simply chosen a convenient shooting position. He had engineered a comprehensive ambush site that maximized his advantages while minimizing his risks. The secondary position on the eastern ridge revealed similar levels of preparation and tactical sophistication. However, Sarah discovered something that the enemy had apparently missed: a single footprint in a patch of soft soil that had been sheltered from wind and weather. The print was partial, but clear enough to provide information about boot size and potentially identifying where patterns. As evening approached, Sarah radioed her initial findings to command while beginning the careful process of documenting everything she had discovered. Her report would become the foundation for a new approach to countering the enemy sniper network, but it also revealed just how formidable her opponents truly were. The enemy snipers weren't simply skilled marksmen operating in familiar terrain. They were systematic professionals who approached warfare with the methodical precision of scientists conducting lethal experiments. They studied American tactics, predicted American responses, and engineered scenarios that turn America's own training and procedures into vulnerabilities that could be exploited with surgical precision. That night, Sarah reviewed her notes and began developing a comprehensive psychological profile of her primary opponent. The sniper she had observed demonstrated patience, intelligence, and tactical creativity that suggested formal military training at the highest levels. His methods indicated not just individual skill, but access to detailed intelligence about American operations that should have been classified. Most importantly, Sarah began to understand that defeating this enemy would require her to think beyond conventional counter-sniper tactics. She would need to become unpredictable in ways that her own training had never emphasized. She would need to study the enemy's methods not just to counter them, but to exceed them. The war she was fighting wasn't just about superior marksmanship. It was about superior thinking. The enemy had built his reputation on being several steps ahead of American forces. Sarah's mission was to get one step ahead of him, and she was beginning to understand exactly what that would require. The hunt was about to become personal, and only one of them would emerge victorious from the deadly game that was already underway. Sarah's transformation from observer to hunter began with a decision that would have seemed insane to most military strategists. Instead of following conventional counter-sniper doctrine that emphasized overwhelming firepower and technological superiority, she chose to adopt the methods and mindset of her enemies. She would become a ghost hunting ghosts, using patience and psychological warfare against opponents who had perfected both arts. The process started with abandoning nearly everything she had learned about military time schedules and operational procedures. The enemy snipers succeeded because they operated outside the predictable rhythms that governed American military activities. Shift changes, meal times, communication schedules, and patrol rotations all created patterns that skilled observers could exploit. To counter enemies who thrived on predictability, Sarah would need to become completely unpredictable herself. Her first major breakthrough came during a week-long solo reconnaissance mission in the Waigali Valley, where intelligence reports suggested one of the enemy snipers had established a temporary base of operations. Instead of conducting a traditional search pattern, Sarah spent 3 days simply lying motionless in carefully chosen observation positions, watching the landscape for any signs of human activity that didn't belong to the natural environment. The revelation came on the 4th day, when Sarah finally understood how the enemy snipers achieved their supernatural ability to anticipate American movements. They weren't relying on advanced intelligence networks or sophisticated surveillance equipment. They were using the mountains themselves as an information gathering system, positioning themselves to observe American activities from multiple angles simultaneously and building detailed behavioral profiles of individual units and personnel. Through her binoculars, Sarah spotted something that intelligence analysts had missed completely. High on a seemingly inaccessible ridge, camouflaged so perfectly that it appeared to be part of the rock formation itself, was an observation post that provided visual coverage of 3 major valley routes and 2 forward operating bases. The position was so well concealed and located at such an extreme elevation that American forces had never considered it a threat. But from that single location, an observer could monitor American activities across dozens of square miles of strategically critical terrain. The enemy wasn't just shooting American soldiers. He was studying them like a scientist studying laboratory specimens. He was learning their habits, their weaknesses, their response patterns, and their psychological breaking points. Each successful attack provided data that made subsequent attacks more effective and more psychologically devastating. Sarah spent another 2 days observing the observation post before she detected signs of human occupancy. The movements were so subtle and infrequent that they would have been invisible to casual observation, but Sarah had trained herself to notice details that existed at the very edge of human perception. A shadow that shifted slightly when the wind couldn't account for the movement. Vegetation that bent in ways that natural weather patterns couldn't explain. Reflections that appeared for fractions of seconds when the sun hit metallic surfaces at specific angles. On the 7th day, Sarah achieved visual confirmation of her target. The enemy sniper was a figure so perfectly integrated with his environment that she had been looking directly at him for hours before her brain finally processed what her eyes were seeing. He wore clothing that matched the natural coloration of the rocks so precisely that it seemed like military camouflage technology that didn't exist in any known arsenal. His movements were so economical and purposeful that they seemed more like natural environmental changes than human activity. But Sarah's most important discovery wasn't visual. It was psychological. As she watched the enemy sniper through her scope, she began to understand the mental discipline that made him so effective. He moved with the patience of someone who measured time not in minutes or hours, but in days and weeks. He positioned himself not for immediate tactical advantage, but for strategic dominance that would pay dividends over extended periods. The enemy sniper wasn't just a marksman. He was a behavioral analyst who used bullets instead of words to communicate with his subjects. Each shot was designed to teach American forces that nowhere was safe, that no precaution was sufficient, and that death could come at any moment from any direction. The psychological impact of this message was far more valuable than the tactical significance of individual casualties. Sarah realized that defeating this opponent would require her to master the same psychological warfare techniques that he employed so effectively. She would need to turn his greatest strength, his patience and methodical approach, into a vulnerability that could be exploited through superior planning and execution. Her opportunity came 2 weeks later, when intelligence reports indicated that the enemy sniper network was planning a coordinated attack on a supply convoy carrying critical medical supplies to isolated forward operating bases. The attack would likely involve multiple shooters positioned at intervals along the convoy route, creating a gauntlet of death that would be nearly impossible for conventional forces to counter. Instead of attempting to protect the convoy through traditional means, Sarah proposed something that initially struck her commanding officers as bordering on suicidal. She would position herself along the convoy route, not to provide overwatch protection, but to hunt the hunters while they were focused on their intended targets. The plan required her to predict not just where the enemy snipers would position themselves, but when they would be most vulnerable to counterattack. The preparation phase consumed 3 weeks of intensive reconnaissance and psychological analysis. Sarah studied the convoy route from the perspective of an enemy sniper, identifying positions that offered optimal shooting angles while providing effective concealment and escape routes. She analyzed wind patterns, lighting conditions, and natural sound masking that would affect both visibility and detectability during different times of day. More importantly, Sarah began developing detailed psychological profiles of her 3 primary targets based on their documented attack patterns and tactical signatures. Alpine, the high-altitude specialist, favored positions that maximized range while minimizing exposure time. Phantom, the behavioral prediction expert, chose locations that allowed him to observe target areas for extended periods before engaging. Shadow, the network leader, positioned himself to coordinate attacks while maintaining options for rapid repositioning. Each enemy sniper represented a different tactical challenge that would require customized solutions. Alpine could be countered through superior ballistic calculations and environmental analysis. Phantom's strength in behavioral prediction could be neutralized by deliberately unpredictable actions that violated standard operating procedures. Shadow's coordination capabilities could be disrupted by forcing him to react to unexpected developments that fell outside his tactical planning. Sarah's final preparation involved something that no military manual had ever recommended. She began training herself to think like her enemies by adopting their operational methods. She spent days at a time in concealed positions, practicing the mental discipline required to remain motionless and alert for extended periods. She studied the psychological techniques that allowed the enemy snipers to maintain perfect emotional control during high-stress situations. Most importantly, Sarah learned to embrace the same cold, analytical mindset that made her enemies so effective. She began viewing the upcoming engagement not as a combat situation, but as a complex problem that could be solved through superior planning, preparation, and execution. Emotion, urgency, and conventional tactical thinking would all be liabilities in the type of warfare she was preparing to conduct. The convoy was scheduled to depart at dawn on a Tuesday morning when mountain mist would provide natural concealment for the vehicles, while creating challenging visibility conditions for long-range engagements. Sarah positioned herself 12 hours before the convoy's departure, using darkness and natural weather patterns to reach a location that conventional tactical thinking would have dismissed as unsuitable for sniper operations. Her hide was positioned not to observe the convoy route directly, but to monitor the approaches to locations where enemy snipers would most likely establish their ambush positions. Sarah wasn't planning to protect the convoy by shooting the enemy snipers before they could engage. She was planning to eliminate them during the brief moments when they would be completely focused on their targets, and therefore vulnerable to attack from unexpected directions. As the first light of dawn began to illuminate the mountain peaks, Sarah settled into the mental state that would be required for the deadly game that was about to begin. She had spent months studying her enemies, learning their methods, and preparing for this moment. Now it was time to discover whether her analysis had been accurate and her preparation sufficient. The enemy snipers had built their reputation on being unbeatable through superior planning and flawless execution. Sarah was about to test whether those same qualities could be turned against them by someone who understood their methods well enough to predict and counter their every move. The hunt was finally beginning in earnest. The morning of the convoy ambush unfolded exactly as Sarah's psychological analysis had predicted, but with a precision that still sent chills down her spine. At 5:43 a.m., while the mountain valleys were still shrouded in pre-dawn darkness, she detected the first signs of enemy movement through her night vision scope. A shadow detached itself from the eastern ridgeline and began moving with a fluid grace that could only belong to one of her three primary targets. Alpine was taking his position. Sarah had spent weeks studying this particular enemy's operational patterns, and his choice of location confirmed her psychological profile with unsettling accuracy. He was positioning himself on the highest available elevation point that offered a clear line of sight to the convoy's planned route. The location provided maximum range advantage while offering multiple escape routes down treacherous slopes that would be nearly impossible for pursuing forces to navigate safely. Through her scope, Sarah watched Alpine establish his hide with the methodical precision of someone who had performed this exact ritual dozens of times before. He used natural materials and prepared camouflage to create concealment so perfect that even Sarah, who knew exactly where to look, occasionally lost visual contact with his position. His movements were economical and purposeful, suggesting the kind of mental discipline that separated true professionals from merely skilled amateurs. But Sarah's months of preparation were about to pay dividends that Alpine couldn't possibly anticipate. Instead of positioning herself to observe the convoy route, Sarah had chosen a location that allowed her to monitor the approaches to Alpine's most likely shooting positions. She wasn't trying to protect the convoy by intercepting enemy fire. She was planning to eliminate the enemy sniper during the brief moments when he would be completely focused on target acquisition and therefore vulnerable to counterattack. At 6:15 a.m., Phantom began his approach to what Sarah's analysis had identified as his preferred type of ambush position. Unlike Alpine, who relied on extreme range and elevation advantage, Phantom specialized in medium-range engagements that allowed him to observe target behavior patterns before taking his shots. His chosen location was a natural cave formation that provided excellent concealment while offering clear sight lines to multiple points along the convoy route. Sarah's pulse remained steady as she watched Phantom settle into his position with the same methodical precision that she had observed in Alpine. The enemy snipers were creatures of habit, and their tactical signatures were as distinctive as fingerprints for someone who had studied them with sufficient intensity. Phantom's positioning confirmed that he intended to wound rather than kill his targets, creating casualties that would require multiple soldiers to evacuate while simultaneously demoralizing the entire convoy through psychological warfare. The most challenging target remained undetected. Shadow, the network leader and most skilled operator, had not yet revealed his position. Sarah's analysis suggested that Shadow would position himself to coordinate the attack while maintaining options for rapid repositioning if circumstances changed unexpectedly. His location would offer excellent observation of the entire engagement area, while providing concealment that was superior to either Alpine or Phantom's positions. At 6:47 a.m., Sarah finally detected signs of Shadow's presence. Unlike his subordinates, who had moved to their positions using direct routes that minimized exposure time, Shadow had approached his location through a complex path that suggested he was conducting counter-surveillance to detect any American forces that might be conducting overwatch operations. His route took nearly twice as long as necessary for simple movement, but it provided him with visual confirmation that no obvious counter-sniper teams were positioned to threaten the planned ambush. Shadow's final position was a masterpiece of tactical selection that demonstrated why he had earned his reputation as the network's most formidable operator. He had chosen a location that was simultaneously concealed from ground observation, aerial surveillance, and the most likely positions for American counter-sniper operations. From his hide, Shadow could observe and potentially coordinate the entire ambush while remaining virtually undetectable to conventional reconnaissance methods. Sarah realized that she was witnessing tactical brilliance that exceeded anything she had encountered in formal military training. The three enemy snipers had positioned themselves to create overlapping fields of fire that would turn the convoy route into a killing zone while maintaining communication capabilities that would allow them to coordinate their attacks for maximum psychological impact. Each shooter was positioned to support the others while maintaining independent capabilities if the tactical situation changed unexpectedly. But Sarah's unconventional approach was about to turn the enemy's greatest strength into a critical vulnerability. By positioning herself to hunt the hunters rather than protect the convoy, she had achieved something that conventional counter-sniper doctrine couldn't provide. She had gained the tactical initiative through superior preparation and psychological analysis. The convoy departed the forward operating base at 7:15 a.m., following a route that had been carefully planned to minimize exposure to known threat areas while maintaining reasonable travel time to critical supply destinations. Sarah watched through her scope as the line of armored vehicles began navigating the winding mountain road with the cautious precision of soldiers who understood they were entering hostile territory. At 7:38 a.m., Alpine fired his first shot. The bullet struck the convoy's communications specialist with surgical precision, passing through a gap in his body armor that couldn't have been more than 4 inches wide. The shot demonstrated ballistic calculations that accounted for wind drift, elevation changes, and target movement with accuracy that bordered on the supernatural. The communications specialist dropped immediately, his radio equipment destroyed by the same bullet that incapacitated him. Sarah had been waiting for this exact moment. Alpine's muzzle flash, barely visible through the morning mist, provided her with precise target acquisition after weeks of approximate position analysis. More importantly, Alpine's attention was completely focused on damage assessment and target selection for his follow-up shot, creating a window of vulnerability that lasted approximately 15 seconds. Sarah's shot traveled 863 meters through challenging mountain air, striking Alpine in the center of his torso with impact energy that eliminated him instantly. The bullet's trajectory had been calculated to account for wind patterns that she had studied for days, elevation differences that required precise ballistic adjustments, and target movement patterns that she had observed during Alpine's positioning phase. The psychological impact of Alpine's elimination on his surviving teammates was immediate and devastating. Phantom, who had been preparing to fire his own shot at the convoy's medic, suddenly found himself in a tactical situation that fell completely outside his operational experience. For the first time in 18 months, the enemy sniper network was reacting to American initiative rather than controlling the tactical situation through superior planning and execution. Shadow's response demonstrated why he had earned his reputation as the network's most dangerous operator. Instead of retreating immediately or attempting to locate Sarah's position through conventional observation methods, Shadow began implementing countermeasures that suggested he possessed formal training in advanced tactical operations. His movements indicated he was attempting to determine the direction and approximate range of Sarah's shot, while simultaneously repositioning to maintain his ability to coordinate Phantom's withdrawal. But Sarah had anticipated this exact response sequence. Her analysis of Shadow's operational patterns had suggested that he would attempt to maintain tactical control even when facing unexpected developments. Shadow's predictable unpredictability was about to become the vulnerability that Sarah would exploit to eliminate the network's most skilled operator. Phantom fired his own shot at 7:41 a.m., striking the convoy's medic in the shoulder with precision that demonstrated his specialization in wounding rather than killing his targets. The shot served its intended psychological purpose. It created a casualty that required immediate attention, while removing the unit's medical capabilities for treating additional casualties. But Phantom's focus on his intended target had created the same vulnerability that had proven fatal for Alpine. Sarah's second shot eliminated Phantom before he could begin his extraction procedure. The bullet traveled 612 meters through mountain air that was beginning to clear as the morning sun burned away the protective mist. Phantom's elimination was clean and instantaneous, leaving Shadow as the only surviving member of a network that had terrorized American forces for 18 months. Shadow's final gambit demonstrated tactical creativity that impressed Sarah even as she prepared to counter it. Instead of attempting immediate withdrawal, Shadow began moving toward a position that would allow him to engage Sarah directly while using the convoy as a psychological shield. His plan was brilliant in its simplicity. He would force Sarah to choose between protecting American soldiers and eliminating the final member of the enemy network. But Sarah had spent months preparing for exactly this type of tactical decision. Her understanding of Shadow's psychological profile suggested that he would attempt to manipulate her emotional responses through threats to American personnel. Shadow's greatest strength was his ability to predict and exploit human behavioral patterns, but Sarah had trained herself to think beyond conventional human responses. At 7:44 a.m., Sarah fired the shot that ended the enemy sniper network's 18-month reign of terror. The bullet eliminated Shadow while he was moving between positions, demonstrating ballistic calculations that accounted for target movement, complex terrain, and environmental conditions that would have challenged the most advanced computer modeling systems. The silence that followed was unlike anything Sarah had experienced in years of combat operations. For the first time in 18 months, American forces in the region could operate without the constant threat of invisible death striking from impossible distances. The psychological impact of the network's elimination would be felt throughout the theater, but the immediate tactical situation still required Sarah's attention. The convoy had taken 2 casualties, both wounded, but stable according to radio reports. American soldiers who had learned to expect death from every ridge and valley were slowly beginning to understand that the rules of engagement had fundamentally changed. The enemy snipers who had seemed unbeatable were gone, eliminated by someone who had learned to think like them while exceeding their capabilities through superior preparation and execution. Sarah remained in her position for another hour, monitoring radio communications and conducting post-engagement analysis that would become the foundation for future counter-sniper operations. The enemy network had been eliminated, but the lessons learned during the hunt would prove invaluable for operations against similar threats in other theaters of operation. The ghosts were dead, and Sarah had become something more dangerous than any of them had ever been. A hunter who could think like her prey while maintaining the tactical initiative through superior psychological analysis and methodical preparation. The aftermath of the convoy ambush created ripple effects throughout the entire theater of operations that no one, including Sarah, could have fully anticipated. Within hours of the engagement, radio chatter across multiple military networks carried reports of something that had seemed impossible just that morning: the complete elimination of the enemy sniper network that had terrorized American forces for 18 months. But Sarah's victory had created unexpected complications that went far beyond simple tactical success. Intelligence analysts who had spent months trying to understand the enemy network suddenly found themselves trying to understand how a single operator had accomplished what entire specialized units had failed to achieve. The psychological impact on American forces was profound, but it was matched by an equally significant impact on enemy forces throughout the region who had considered the sniper network invincible. Colonel Richards arrived at Sarah's position 6 hours after the engagement, accompanied by intelligence specialists and forensic teams that would spend days analyzing the 3 elimination sites. His expression combined relief, admiration, and a concern that Sarah was beginning to understand had nothing to do with tactical celebrations. "Mitchell, what you accomplished today changes everything," the colonel said as they walked among the rocky formations where the enemy snipers had positioned themselves. "But it also creates problems that we're still trying to understand." The forensic analysis of the 3 shooting positions revealed the true extent of the enemy network sophistication and the magnitude of Sarah's tactical achievement. Alpine's hide contained equipment that demonstrated access to advanced technology that shouldn't have been available to irregular forces. Custom-modified rifles, specialized ammunition, and communication devices suggested support from state-level actors who had invested significant resources in creating an elite counter-American capability. Phantom's position yielded intelligence that was even more disturbing. Maps marked with detailed information about American patrol patterns, communication schedules, and personnel rotation procedures indicated the enemy possessed intelligence capabilities that had never been fully understood by American counterintelligence services. The enemy hadn't just been shooting American soldiers. They had been conducting systematic surveillance operations that collected information far beyond what was necessary for tactical success. Shadow's elimination site provided the most crucial intelligence discoveries. Documents recovered from his position revealed that the sniper network was part of a larger enemy operation designed to create psychological warfare effects that would influence American political and military decision-making at the strategic level. The snipers weren't just trying to inflict casualties. They were attempting to create conditions that would force American withdrawal from the entire region through accumulated psychological pressure. Sarah spent the following weeks working with intelligence analysts to piece together the full scope of what they had been facing. The enemy sniper network had represented just one component of a sophisticated psychological warfare campaign that combined precision military action with strategic communication efforts designed to amplify the psychological impact of battlefield successes through American media coverage and political commentary. The 3 eliminated snipers had been specially selected and trained for a mission that went far beyond traditional military objectives. They had been equipped with advanced technology, provided with detailed intelligence about American operations, and instructed to create specific psychological effects that would serve strategic political purposes rather than merely tactical battlefield advantages. But the intelligence discoveries also revealed why Sarah's unconventional approach had been so successful. The enemy had planned for every contingency except the possibility that American forces would abandon conventional tactical doctrine in favor of methods that mirrored their own operational philosophy. Sarah's decision to hunt the hunters using their own techniques had created a scenario that fell completely outside the enemy's strategic planning. The psychological impact of the network's elimination extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. American soldiers who had spent months living in fear of invisible death began operating with confidence levels that hadn't been seen in the region for over a year. Patrol routes that had been abandoned due to sniper threats were reopened. Forward operating bases that had been effectively isolated by fear of long-range attacks resumed normal operations. But the most significant impact was on enemy forces throughout the region who had relied on the sniper network's psychological warfare effects to maintain tactical advantages in other types of operations. The elimination of fighters who had seemed invincible created doubt and uncertainty among enemy units that had never directly faced American forces. The psychological momentum that had favored enemy operations for 18 months had suddenly shifted in favor of American forces. Sarah found herself at the center of attention that she had never sought and wasn't entirely comfortable receiving. Military leadership wanted detailed debriefings about her methods so they could be incorporated into training programs for other specialized units. Intelligence services wanted comprehensive analysis of her psychological profiling techniques so they could be applied to other theaters of operation. Media representatives wanted interviews about her achievement so they could create stories that would counteract the negative psychological effects that the enemy network had been designed to produce. The request for information created ethical dilemmas that Sarah hadn't anticipated when she began her hunt for the enemy snipers. Her methods had been successful precisely because they departed from conventional military doctrine in ways that emphasized individual initiative over institutional procedures. Attempts to systematize her approach might eliminate the very qualities that had made her effective against enemies who specialized in countering systematic approaches. More troubling were intelligence reports suggesting that other enemy networks in different regions were studying the elimination of the mountain snipers to develop countermeasures that would protect them against similar operations. Sarah's success had provided American forces with valuable tactical advantages, but it had also educated enemy forces about American capabilities that had previously been unknown to them. 6 months after the convoy engagement, Sarah received orders for a new assignment that reflected both the value of her proven capabilities and the military's recognition that her methods represented something fundamentally different from conventional special operations doctrine. She would be leading a specialized unit tasked with identifying and eliminating high-value enemy assets that conventional forces couldn't effectively counter. The unit would operate with minimal institutional oversight and maximum tactical flexibility, allowing Sarah to apply the psychological analysis and unconventional methods that had proven so effective against the mountain sniper network. But the assignment also carried responsibilities that went far beyond individual tactical success. Sarah's methods would become the foundation for a new approach to asymmetric warfare that would influence American military doctrine for years to come. Her first briefing for the new unit included intelligence about enemy networks operating in 3 different theaters of operation, each presenting unique challenges that would require customized solutions based on detailed psychological analysis and patient preparation. The enemy forces she would be hunting had studied her previous success and adapted their operations to counter the methods she had used against the mountain snipers. Sarah realized that her victory had marked the beginning of an entirely new type of warfare rather than the end of a specific tactical challenge. She had proven that enemies who seemed unbeatable could be defeated through superior psychological analysis and unconventional tactical thinking. But Her success had also created a dynamic where each victory would require new methods and approaches because enemy forces would continuously adapt to counter her proven capabilities. The reputation she had earned through eliminating the mountain sniper network would both help and hinder her future operations. American forces would have confidence in her capabilities that would facilitate operational support and resource allocation. But enemy forces would also have detailed knowledge of her methods that would allow them to prepare countermeasures and psychological warfare techniques designed specifically to neutralize her advantages. As Sarah prepared for her new assignment, she understood that she had become something unprecedented in modern warfare. A hunter whose reputation was itself a weapon that could influence enemy behavior and tactical decision-making. The psychological warfare techniques she had learned from studying her enemies had transformed her into someone who could achieve strategic effects through tactical actions that went far beyond the immediate results of successful engagements. The enemy snipers who had terrorized American forces for 18 months were gone, but their legacy lived on in the methods Sarah had developed to counter them. She had learned to think like her enemies while exceeding their capabilities, creating a new model for asymmetric warfare that would influence military operations around the world. The ghosts in the mountains had been eliminated, but Sarah had become something even more formidable, a legend whose very existence would change the way future wars would be fought. Her transformation from conventional soldier to unconventional hunter was complete, and the next chapter of her story was about to begin in theaters of operation where new enemies were already preparing for her arrival.